You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, women's hockey fans. Welcome to another Women's Hockey Spotlight on Locked On NHL. I am the host of Locked On Kraken, Erica L. Ayala. You can find Locked On Kraken anywhere you listen to Locked On NHL and on your favorite audio listening device. You can also catch us on Sirius SXM. Just search Kraken or any of your other favorite Locked On shows. Okay. We're going to get into the Women's Hockey Spotlight. And first, I just want to remind you that the Toronto Maple Leafs advanced to the second round of the playoffs for first time in 19 years, 19 seasons. And I think they need to thank the Toronto Six for lifting the curse. That's right. Just a reminder that the Premier Hockey Federation, Toronto Six, won the Isabelle Cup Championship. But on to more pressing matters. Speaking of the Premier Hockey Federation, they have announced all of their postseason awards. I should say most, because we still have the fan vote. And it is Friday, May 5th, Cinco de Mayo. You have until 11:59 Eastern Time tonight to vote for your favorite three players of the Premier Hockey Federation. This will be a fan vote. But in the other categories, let's walk through the big ticket items. Now, the Dena Lang Award is awarded to one player that has shown and has overcome some obstacles. Dena Lang got injured in that inaugural season at the Winter Classic, actually, as Les Canadiens took on the Boston Pride. And once again, a player from the Boston Pride would win the award. Lauren Kelly wins the 2023 Dena Lang Award. Now, this year we had both Rookie of the Year and Newcomer of the Year in the league. The differentiation: a rookie, first ever pro season, whereas a newcomer is new to the Premier Hockey Federation, but not new to women's pro hockey. Rookie of the Year, you had two players from Boston, Elizabeth Giguère and Corinne Schroeder, goaltender, as well as Minnesota Whitecaps forward Natalie Snodgrass were the three finalists, and it would be Corinne Schroeder that takes home the award. For Newcomer of the Year, you had Anne-Sophie Betty representing La Force de Montreal. You had Lauren Gable representing the Boston Pride and Brittany Howard representing the Toronto Six. In this category, Lauren Gable takes home Newcomer of the Year award. Goaltender of the Year, mentioned Corinne Schroeder, plays for the Boston Pride. Also had Amanda Levier and Elaine Chuli. Elaine Chuli, the starting netminder for the Toronto Six, and Amanda Levier, the starting netminder for the Minnesota Whitecaps, went head-to-head in that overtime championship game, but neither one would win this one. That's right, Corinne Schroeder, goaltender of the year. Now, you might see a little bit of a trend. Lots of Boston players winning awards. We'll get to that in just a moment. Let's go to Defender of the Year, your top three candidates. Minttu Tuominen from the Metropolitan Riveters, Sydney Morin from the Minnesota Whitecaps, and Callie Flanagan from the Boston Pride. And yes, once again, a Boston Pride player wins. Congratulations to Callie Flanagan for winning Defender of the Year. Now we have two more award categories that I'm going to mention for the on-ice performance, and then another category that mentions a little bit more of what players from each organization are doing in the community. So let's go with Outstanding Player of the Year. This is actually an award that was voted on by the players. Now, if you follow my women's hockey podcast, the Founding Four podcast, we had a Twitter Spaces. We'll have another one coming up next Tuesday. But on our Twitter Spaces, we talked about and talked with Carly Jackson, one of the goaltenders for the Toronto Six. And this is the way it went. The players were asked to submit their names of who they thought the most outstanding player of the season was. And from those names, we got 3 finalists: Lauren Gable, Kennedy Marchment, and Corrine Schroeder. Now, the most valuable player was actually voted on by the Professional Hockey Writers Association Women's Hockey Chapter, which, if you follow the Women's Hockey Spotlight, you know that I am the new chair of this very new chapter. And it was very exciting for us to be able to vote on these awards. And we had the same 3 most valuable players: Lauren Gable, Kennedy Marchment, and Corrine Schroeder. And wouldn't you know, Lauren Gable not only sweeps these 2 awards voted on by the players and voted on by the writers, but that is a clean sweep for the Boston Pride of all awards. Now, I just told you that it was the Toronto Six and the Minnesota Whitecaps that made it to the final. But just like most awards in most leagues, this is all based on the regular season. Now, it's changed from year to year because in the past, media members, even without the Professional Hockey Writers Association, we've been able to vote on Defender of the Year, Goaltender of the Year. This was done more internally this year. We didn't really get an explanation as to why. Either way, Boston, is that a good thing that they sweep the awards? Were there some performances that didn't crack the finalists for each of the categories? And I think the answer to the latter is definitely yes. I think that we had more robust performances than were outlined here. And I'm very curious to see how now with the Professional Hockey Writers Association, we're able to vote not just on MVP, but maybe some of these other awards, but we'll have to stay tuned for that. Now, with regard to if it's a good thing that Boston won all of the awards, they were the more dominant team for most of the regular season. Now, seeing things in hindsight, of course, it being 2020, it does raise an eyebrow or two, but that just goes to show you that you can't take any days off. The Minnesota Whitecaps, and we talked about this on the Women's Hockey Spotlight, they dropped 8 consecutive games heading into the postseason. They played a good enough road record to be able to make it as one of the top 4 teams in the league out of 7 teams. That's how they got to the playoffs. And it was a rocky road heading into the playoffs. But then they draw the number 1 seed, the Boston Pride, and they sweep them. That's right, a 3-game series, and Boston gets swept. Minnesota's offense opens up. And so while it might seem odd that we have all Boston players winning awards, and yes, I do think there was some conversation to be had in some of these categories, you can't deny the dominance that they had in the regular season. But I think it's also kind of cool that it shows that you have to show up every game, especially when there's a championship on the line. And that's what Minnesota did. They shocked the PHF community. They certainly shocked the Boston Pride. But unfortunately, they couldn't get past the Toronto Six, though we did get an amazing final, back and forth. Mentioned it goes into overtime. We've talked about it here on the show. And then Teresa Vanishova, one of the multiple Czech national team players, had a fantastic forecheck and is able to beat Amanda Levier to give the Toronto Six their first ever championship. And they were the first Canadian expansion team. Montreal joined the league just this year. So it was historic, it was exciting, and it all went down in Arizona. I was there as the in-arena host. So that's what's happening. Or I should say that's what happened with awards. But what's happening now is free agency. Last time we talked a little bit about Madison Packer and her exiting her 2-year contract. And all reports are leaning towards Madison Packer returning to the Metropolitan Riveters. Now, speaking of the Minnesota Whitecaps, they did name a few players that they have signed, or I should say re-signed, including a player that I really thought should have gotten a lot more coverage. And that is Britton Fleming. Britton Fleming was an outstanding forward, and she inks a 2-year deal with the Minnesota Whitecaps. They also announced that defender Olivia Knowles has signed a 2-year deal. So we have the Whitecaps announcing some signings. But if you follow Dan Rice, who's a part of the Professional Hockey Writers Association women's chapter and writes about the New Jersey Devils, Dan Rice has also been hosting some Twitter spaces for the Ice Garden. And Ian Kennedy over at the Hockey News, which now has its own women's hockey vertical, those are just two of a handful of reporters that are keeping their finger on the pulse when it comes to off-season trades and re-signings and other rumors. And the rumor mill is hot in the Premier Hockey Federation. Word on the street is that defender for the Boston Pride, that being Kaylee Fratkin, and a founding member of the league, as well as Ali Thunstrom, might be on the move from Boston. We've also heard reports connecting goaltender of the year and rookie of the year Corrine Schroeder to Montreal. She's originally Canadian. Elizabeth Giguère, I also mentioned in the awards section, played for Boston, competed with Canada in the rivalry series that we've been talking about, perhaps also could be going to Montreal. So we know there's going to be a $1.5 million salary cap next season. We already know one player, Daryl Watts, is set to make $150K US dollars. She signed with the Toronto Six and, of course, was a mid-season signing for them, so won a championship with them. But how is this influx of money and the salary cap going to affect the players and certain teams? Are we going to have super teams like we've seen in the WNBA when they raised their salary cap 2 seasons ago? All of that and more is what we will continue to discuss on the Women's Hockey Spotlight. Not to mention that the PWHPA, the Professional Women's Hockey Players Association, which created a barnstorming model in 2019 or immediately after 2019 when the news of the Canadian Women's Hockey League, or the CWHL, folded, they are set to become a proper union. So the PWHPA would become the union name, and there is a new league coming. We have been hearing that it could come as soon as this past season. That didn't happen. We're hearing that it might be ready for the fall. So we just kind of have to wait and see. All I know is it's going to be a busy offseason in women's hockey, and you can follow us right here on Locked On NHL. And if you want a little bit more of a taste of women's hockey on a day-to-day basis, go follow the Founding Four podcast, the Ice Garden, or even every once in a while, Locked On Kraken. But at least wait until the Seattle Kraken are in the postseason for those updates. But as always, Erica L. Ayala, your women's hockey correspondent, every other Friday, right here on Locked On NHL, bringing you the PHF Awards recap. We talked a little bit about what could be a wild and crazy free agency and some rumors that we're hearing from the women's hockey side of things. Of course, we didn't even get into the transfer portal for the NCAA, so you're going to want to come back later in the month where we'll update that. Is NIL and kind of this free reign transfer portal somewhat impacted by COVID? Does that make it so that we're going to have NCAA super teams? Let's talk about it. We'll get to you in another 2 weeks right here for the Women's Hockey Spotlight on Locked On NHL.